Join me, and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of As Father and Son. On this episode, we're going to be talking about episode 3 of the brand new Disney Plus show, The Acolyte, entitled Destiny. So, this is our first kind of flashback episode, trying to give us some backstory on what happened on Brendock. Um, and it's a really fascinating episode because it gives you a lot of, like I said, it gives you a lot of this backstory and answers some questions, but starts some new questions. We're going to get as heavy into this as we can. We'll try to talk out some of these things and see what we figure out, and then you guys can let us know what you think also. So, Harrison, you want to talk to us about what you thought of it and where we go from here.
Yeah. So just initial thoughts about the episode. I really enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoy any piece of Star Wars media that delves deeply into the Force as a topic. And this episode put that front and center with the dichotomy between the Force witches and the Jedi. And I
Mm-hmm.
was very interested in that relationship and the kind of similarities as well as the differences between the Jedi philosophy and the witch philosophy
Mm-hmm.
and the relationship that May and Osha had to the witches. And there's some interesting things inside of this episode, some controversial things as well that the fandom have kind of latched onto. But I have some pretty fair explanations for a lot of these things that I think a lot of people are getting up in arms about, but it really isn't as serious as they think.
Right. Well, I tend to think that a lot of the fandom who definitely are the ones who get up in arms about a lot of stuff, they're the ones who they're kind of like casual people, somewhat similar to me, because I don't read a lot of the side stuff or the manuals or anything like that. And
Mm.
um and I've read some of the comic books, but it's been a while and I need to catch up again. But outside of that, I'm pretty casual in terms of my fandom. But you're a lot more invested in it and you read a lot of the extra stuff. So it would be cool to hear your perspective on it with your knowledge of it and to see if like maybe that might help some of these people who maybe don't know some of this stuff, if that's what it's in regards to some of the
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of referencing of the Plagueis novel that I am unsure of if people have read sometimes or have just read a Wikipedia article
right.
about it. And so there's some things I'll bring up a little bit later about
Okay.
specifically there's a scene inside of the episode which implies some form of immaculate conception that
Right.
people have latched on to as a either a as a un I guess I don't know how to put it. Uh Basically kind of sullying Anakin's origins or kind of contradicting them, I guess. And so
Interesting.
I'll bring that up once we get to that part of the episode. But there's
Okay.
a lot that happens before that
Right.
that is also important to talk about.
Yeah. Well, the episode starts off with the two girls, Osha and May, outside of the fortifications of the place that these force witches live in. We don't really get a name for who these force witches are, but there's some maybe slight evidence that they could be members of the Night Sisters or maybe even precursors to the Night Sisters of Dathomir.
Mhm.
Because
There's similar architecture to what we've seen in Ahsoka.
okay, all right. So that's what's great having you on this show
Hmm.
is because you catch all that stuff. You catch all
Yeah,
the
yeah.
interesting things, or you've heard about it because you delve into the fan circles a little bit. You hear
Hmm.
what other people are talking about. I
Well,
kind of
and
keep myself out of that.
yeah, oh yeah, you're fine. But you're kind of hitting the nail on the head in terms of I truly believe they are Night Sisters. I think that they are
Yeah,
Night Sisters either in the same vein that the Night Sisters on Peridia are, or they were some kind of offshoot of the Night Sisters that's gotten off of Dathomir.
right,
But the fact that it's a bunch of Force Witches and there's also Zabrak among their ranks is a very key indicator that they are Night Sisters, or at least from Dathomir
right.
in some degree. And so,
Yeah, and that's what it
um,
led. That's how I made that assumption, and I'm sure most people made that assumption as well because once they saw the the uh, the other mother, and I can't remember her name right now, but the Zabrak mother, she seeing her like immediately made me go, oh, they're probably Night Sisters. So I think that that's generally what most people are going to assume. And I'm sure that's what they're wanting us to assume at this point. So it may or may not come to pass. It'll be interesting. And that's again where we get some answers, but then we have more questions because they don't really answer that in this episode. So they just kind of tease out these little morsels to us and make us want to like find out more. So, which is great. That's how good TV show is. So
yeah. And for me, the interesting thing about it, like I said, is the portrayal of other Force users. And
yes,
I am happy that we're delving more into that, even if it's the same kind of Force users that we've seen in many of the shows where they kind of keep bouncing back to the Night Sisters. That to me is still interesting and more engaging than just kind of interacting with the Jedi the entire time.
right,
And it helps serve the story about the Jedi and how they interact with other Force sensitive cults around the galaxy. And so
right,
I'm interested in seeing how that plays out. It's also very interesting for just a backstory element of May and Osha's character that they are so in some form related to Night Sisters or at least the Witches of Dathomir. That kind of gives them a, especially if it is Night Sisters, a overlying darkness to their
right.
characters, and it it has a lot of implications for later on.
Yeah, definitely. I
But oh yeah.
No, I was just going to mention because we see this point in there. The girls go back to uh the uh the compound or whatever, and they being primed for this thing called the Ascension. And both of the sisters are going to be part of this Ascension, but Osha doesn't really want to be part of it. She's bucking kind of against this nature that she's being told she has to be a part of. She wants to go out and explore the universe. Meanwhile, May is like, no, we need to stay here. This is all we need. And so there's this you know opposing forces between the two of them. Um, and and it's just yeah, and it shows because there's this sequence where Mother Anastasia is trying to uh, kind of teach them some stuff about the Force, and they're constantly fighting and bickering behind her back. Um, but I know you want to kind of get into what Mother Anastasia was saying during this sequence too, because it's important
Yeah,
information, sort of.
what I found really interesting about what she was saying was that it's almost verbatim of what Yoda tells Luke on Dagobah what the Force is.
Right,
And that is very interesting to me because it showcases how similar the Jedi philosophy and the Night Sister philosophy are at its core,
right,
but it is a different in perspective and a different of use that separates them. And for the Night Sisters, they see it as threads that you can pull, as she mentioned inside of her little speech, versus the Jedi, which see themselves at the will of the Force. And so there's a certain level of um, almost like independence or uh, control over the Force that the Night Sisters preach that the Jedi don't.
Right.
And so that was very interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a great sequence because I caught that too. You and I watched it at different points, so we didn't watch it together. But so we both came to it when we talked about it before we talked about the podcast. And we were both caught it and we were like, "Oh, this is interesting. This is something we definitely want to bring up because it does show that throughout most of these like um force using, at least through a couple of them anyway, we haven't really experienced too many yet, and they're differing philosophies, but if one is the witches of Dathomir and the other is the Jedi, and their base philosophies are the same, um it just it's interesting because is that very similar for all of them? The Sith wielders and everything else are all of them
Mm-hmm.
very similar in their own ways, just more about how they think they go about using the Force. Because where the Jedi, like you said, the Jedi feel like they are being guided by the Force, and these witches, because we don't know that they're Night Sisters, but these witches, this coven of witches, they feel like they can pull on the Force. They pull on these threads of the Force. And theirs is closer in a lot of ways to magic. They're using it in a very magical sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that interesting too, because it just a little bit after this, they go through the ascension um, ceremony, and you can clearly see behind them there's either moons or planets aligning during this ceremony, and there's some power coming from that. So, or the witches themselves are gaining some kind of power through that, or feel like they're gaining some power through that. Whether or not they actually are, that's left up to interpretation. So I just find it fascinating that we have these differing force users, but they all seem to kind of fall into that um basic same
Yeah,
philosophy.
there's also one of the things that I really enjoyed about that scene with the Ascension is
Right.
that they continued the idea that when cultures like theirs, the witches or any witch of Dathomir practices any kind of force control, that it requires vocalization. It requires some kind of
Mm,
singing or song or
right.
chanting. And that's something that inside of the book Courtship of Princess Leia, where the witches of Dathomir are introduced, kind of takes Luke off guard and actually makes Luke somewhat of a superhuman to them, in that he is able to command the Force without doing that. And
Right.
so and so it's kind of interesting about how the witches still do that, but are also very aware of the Jedi inside of the galaxy in terms of what we've seen inside of this episode.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, it's exciting. It's exciting for me as a longtime viewer of this universe, um, to see all of these different aspects being explored. And I know they explored them in the comics and the books and stuff like that, but it's cool to see it explored in these new ways, especially these more canon ways, whereas things weren't so canon before. You know what I mean? So
Mm-hmm.
it's really fun to just, I don't know, delve into these other cultures and everything. It's something I've always been fascinated with in the real world, is learning other cultures and how we all actually connect in a lot of similar ways. So that's what's fun about these this coven of witches, and how at the end of the day, as much as they're different, they are still kind of very similar as well. And they don't get me wrong, they're very different in a lot of ways as well. But those similarities that can bind us as well are great. It's interesting to see it, and I'm glad they're exploring it in this series.
Yeah, the next thing that really grabbed me inside of the episode is when the Jedi do arrive on the planet after Osha kind of has this moment with May, like you said, about wanting to go off and do better things or explore the galaxy. We get this moment with the Jedi where the Jedi arrive and they're seeking two force sensitive children that are on the planet.
Right.
And the witches deny their presence on the planet. And the Jedi essentially basically say, we're going to stick around until you hand them over. And that's when Osha steps forward and interacts with Soul for the first time. And so we get to see their first interaction, which is a very interesting interaction where Soul approaches her from a standpoint of almost trying to kind of infatuate her with the Jedi because he hands her his lightsaber and basically tells her about it
Yeah.
and asks her if she wants to go with him. And then we see the witches do something very uncool by possessing Torben's body
Yeah.
for a moment. And it seems painful. It doesn't seem like it's something that was particularly pleasant while he was being possessed. And the Jedi essentially have to take the hint and back off and have to come back later. But I'm trying to remember the exact specifics of the episode, but there's some instance in which the Jedi essentially have some kind of authority over this coven in basically requiring the children to be tested.
Well, the what they claim is that they have the right to test children
Right.
on any Republic world. But the witch's mother Anastasia is very quick, or even the other one, the one of the two mothers is very quick to point out that Brendock is not a Republic planet.
Mhm.
But yet the Jedi do not back down.
Yeah.
They continue to, you know, force the issue, pun not intended. But they you manage, and because I think that if it weren't for the fact that Osha was so willful at that point, and wanting not to be a part of that, wanting to get away, that I think that they could have potentially kept them hidden longer, or at the very least, a maybe the Jedi would have had to force something a little bit more violent to
Hmm.
make it happen. But um, when uh, but because OSHA came forward like that, they kind of deflated some of it. And the what is it? The mothers did not want to. I think in a way they understood that if they forced it, they might lose them and like fully, and then maybe play the hand a little bit tighter, um and maybe just go, okay, well, let's see how this plays out if we let them go ahead and test the girls, and and that's why they tell them to lie, so in the test. So it's a it's an interesting sequence too, just because Osha just really wants to, once she's encountered these Jedi, she's full in. You know, she didn't want to be part of this ascension.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Once she's
and
presented with a chance to leave.
yeah, exactly. So go ahead.
Oh yeah. Just moving on from there. This is one of the scenes that I really enjoy. Is uh there's and well, actually, before I get to the one that I was about to go into, which is when they actually do get tested at the Jedi ship. Before this, there is a short exchange with Anastasia and the other mother about the Jedi possibly figuring out how May and Osha were born. And
Right.
there is I can't remember the exact wording, but there's essentially a wording in which they are concerned about how the Jedi figuring out how they were created, and they use the word created.
Well,
And
the Mother Coral, that's the Zabrak's
okay,
name,
okay,
Mother Coral. She says, I carried them. And then Mother Anastasia says, yes, but I created them.
right, right,
And so
and
and that just is like,
so
okay, that left
yeah,
a whole
yeah,
bomb there for everybody in the audience.
yeah, yeah.
So
So there's a lot of people online that are concerned that that in some way invalidates Anakin's immaculate conception inside of Phantom Menace, and thereby makes him not the chosen one or not the only chosen one, and breaks canon or breaks the original movies or in some way contradicts or ruins everything that they hold dear to their hearts. And I think that that's ludicrous. Um, I think that
agreed.
I think that ultimately all that this means is that the Night Sisters or whatever witches are on Brendok have in some way found a way to create life through the Force.
Right.
And that does not necessarily mean that it is the same way that Anakin was born, because a lot of people have been referencing Darth Plagueis and also referencing the Darth Vader comic that seems to suggest that Palpatine created Anakin. I believe I've read somewhere that the artist and writer of that comic have both come out and said that that is not what they intended with those panels to depict. It was just a vision of Palpatine essentially grooming Anakin since birth, not that he literally created him.
Right.
And inside of Plagueis, Plagueis did not create Anakin, but there is a point in the Darth Plagueis novel in which Plagueis and Sidious are working on a Sith ritual to essentially break the barriers between break the barriers that the Jedi have put inside of the Force to not let the dark side swell. And they perform this ritual and they do so well in it that they feel a rebuking force inside of the Force itself. And it's so powerful and so jarring that both of them are afraid for a moment. And there's a heavy implication that that is the birth of Anakin,
Interesting.
because that was essentially the Force's reckoning, like the Force's will, like imposing itself on the galaxy with the creation of Anakin, because the Force had been so disrupted by this dark side influence that they were trying to create. It was
Right.
trying to balance the Force back in the direction of balance and not to outweigh it with the dark side like they were trying to do. And so ultimately what happens in this episode does not contradict either Plagueis or the original movies, because the Immaculate Conception of Anakin has nothing to do with what May and Osha have had happen. There's no evidence to that. We still, as a like in terms of the Star Wars franchise, don't know how Anakin was born. There has been
Right.
no definitive answer to how that occurred.
And the same with
And
the Osha and May. We don't know. We don't
exactly.
have a we just have what they said on the screen at that moment. That doesn't mean
Yeah.
anything. It could mean that. And again, even if it does mean that they were immaculately concepted via, force use or whatever, through some kind of magic, force use or whatever, that doesn't negate Anakin still being the quote unquote chosen one. And because even that whole chosen one prophecy is some Jedi weird prophecy thing. It doesn't mean that it's an actual thing anyway. So it does, you know what I mean? Because like ultimately, like it just brings up so many other things that we're gonna get into in future episodes, of course. But for the purposes of this episode itself, what happened with them saying that doesn't negate anything. Because again, it's pretty ambiguous.
No.
So
It is. It's absolutely ambiguous. There's no answers that
Yeah.
they give us throughout the entire episode after that point about
Right.
what that meant.
Yeah.
There's just a implication that there was some form of forced conception. There was some kind of creation, which again is not something that we are strangers to in terms of what the Night Sisters or other witches of Dathomir can do, because we've already seen them imbue life into things that are dead. And
Yeah.
so if they're able to do that, if they're able to resurrect the dead, it's not totally out of the realm of possibility that they would be able to create life itself. And so it's not something that is like, I don't know. It's not as something as serious or as game changing to the Star Wars universe as I think a lot of people think it is. It's actually pretty isolated to the
Right.
show. And until we know more about what is going to happen in terms of the story or the backstory of Osha and May and how they were born, it's really kind of not pertinent to anything else outside of the
Right.
show.
Right.
And
Well,
so,
and that's the thing too, is even if it comes down to at the end of the day, even if it comes to it and at the end of the season, they're like, yeah, they were immaculately concepted, they were created by the Force, blah, blah, blah. It still doesn't negate whatever Anakin is. You know, and like that's
Yeah.
ultimately what is weird about this whole situation is that some people who are using the dark side of the Force are creating life, whatever that means, in however this works. You know what I mean? So it doesn't negate Anakin. It doesn't negate. It just means these people are using the Force in unnatural ways. That's ultimately what it is.
Yeah.
They're using it in unnatural ways that most people,
the dark side is a pathway to many abilities that some would consider unnatural.
exactly. So yeah. So when it really comes down to it, as much as to me, I'm fascinated by that. Like I'm hoping that is the case. You know, I'm hoping they were immaculately concepted via Force magic because that's an interesting.
Well, that wouldn't be immaculate, but it would.
Well, you know what I mean.
Would,
you know what I mean.
To be artificially created is a very interesting idea.
Yes.
It also brings up a lot of the themes of Star Wars in terms of cloning, as well as genetics.
Yeah, there's
a lot
a
of
whole
stuff
bunch of that stuff
inside of
going
the
on. Yeah.
prequels as that is all about cloning and genetics. And
Yeah.
this actually leads into what I was going to say for what my favorite sequence of that episode is that when Osha goes to be tested by the Jedi, she is told to lie about her Force potential. And she willingly fails the test. But the Jedi are able to very quickly see through it because they're able to see that Osha's emotions and mind is elsewhere. She wants to leave. She wants to pass this test. She wants to tell the truth. And in that process, though, there is a moment that's almost a throwaway moment where Torben very discreetly tests her blood.
Right.
And that's a heavy moment if you've seen the prequels, because if you've seen the prequels, you know that the likelihood is that they're testing her midichlorian levels. And that's super important for what ultimately is my theory about what happens later in the episode after a lot of things go down. But ultimately, what is interesting is that the Jedi know that Osha is lying, and that the Jedi know that Osha wants to leave with them. And that blood test that they do, I think, is the catalyst for a lot of things that happen later inside of the episode. But I don't want to move past the testing scene if you wanted to say anything before I move on to that.
No.
Because the episode moves pretty dang fast after the testing scene.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, well then moving on after the testing scene, we get a moment where Osha speaks with Sol about joining the Jedi, and Osha is told by Sol that she has to have the bravery to tell the truth, which is a very interesting line, especially considering that it seems like a lot of Jedi are lying in the aftermath of this event.
Right.
And so a lot of these Jedi are not holding up to the same ideals that Soul presents to Osha as what is key to being a Jedi. And that seemed important to me as a line, and I don't know if as many people noticed that one. But moving on after that, she is getting ready to leave as she has accepted her new place among the Jedi. And she tells her mother, and there's a heartfelt moment between her mother, which has a lot of echoes. There's a lot of echoes in that moment between her mother and the moment in which Anakin has to leave his mother in Phantom Menace, in terms of the goodbye as well as the respect of the choice. But what's interesting about this instance is that the mother also has a choice in terms of protecting her coven and the future of her coven, which it seems that May and Osha are very integral to it. And so that kind of sets off some alarm bells for things that are going to happen later. And
Right.
then the episode moves very quickly after this point where Osha is getting ready to leave. She picks up this very interesting triangular manual that has a Jedi symbol.
It's her drawing book. She was drawing in it earlier.
Interesting.
Yeah, she was drawing in it. So that makes it even more interesting.
So then maybe she did that to the book itself.
She did. She was drawing that picture earlier, and May asked her what she was drawing, and she closed it and was like, I don't want to show you. There's things I don't want to show you. So she was obviously seeing, for anybody that didn't catch what that symbol is, and I mean, hopefully you did if you're listening to this show. It's the Jedi symbol, and it's so did she see that someplace, out in the woods or whatever before that, or did she just how was that? How did she know about that symbol? So which again leads to so many questions about what the Jedi are doing and everything else. So I mean, what we kind of know about the High Republic is that the Jedi are everywhere, so it would make sense if she's seen it before. But that is interesting. I didn't catch that about her. It's a drawing book. But after that moment, May confronts her about leaving, and May says that her life and the Coven's lives are being torn apart by the fact that she's leaving, and essentially that the only way to save the Coven and her life is to kill Osha and prevent her from leaving. Yeah.
Which is very dark and very drastic for a child to escalate the situation to. Which she very much does by locking the door and setting the building on fire. Then we get a very fast montage of Osha escaping the facility, ultimately finding herself at a precipice with May on the other side, where May is uncharacteristically after the last time we've seen her, concerned about Osha and hoping that Osha will leap over the precipice to the other side to her. But before either of them can make a move, both sides of the bridge collapse, and May falls in while Osha begins to fall, and Soul at the nick of time comes and grabs her and pulls her up, and then whisks her away onto the Jedi shuttle and taking her to Coruscant.
And as they're leaving, they pass a whole bunch of the witches' bodies and stuff like that, just laying on the ground, like all dead somehow. And you hear at one point where Osha's trying to escape and everything like that. There's a boom, and then there's
some kind of explosion,
a whole bunch of screams that happen above her. And so I have questions about this. I know you have a theory about this as well.
Yes.
But like my whole thing is how did they die so quickly? How did that fire spread so quickly? Like don't get me wrong, I get fire spread really fast. But that just seemed to be crazy fast.
For one little fire at the very bottom of the facility to spread that entire building. And to have them all dead, but not on fire or smoldering or embering at all.
Yeah, it didn't look like any of the bodies were burned from what I could see, but I mean, they didn't focus on them as
the other thing that stands out to me is when she tries to rush to her mother, Soul pulls her away, almost in a you can interpret it as there's no time, we have to get out of here.
Yeah.
But you can also interpret it as don't look too close. At
Right.
like
If you go
trying to
with the
hide
theory
something.
if you go with the theory that you have.
Yes,
Yeah.
I have a theory. It's a very cockamamie theory at times, but I think that it's pretty sound in terms of what we have been given so far in terms of evidence.
All right. Well, why
And
don't you
so
hit us with your
yeah,
theory?
so this is my theory because ultimately they escape Brendok and they go off to Coruscant, and I believe that's pretty much the end of the episode. But my theory on what happened on Brendok, because the entire facility burns down, it crumbles, and the entire coven is wiped out and dead.
And you don't
As far as we
see
know.
any of
As
this.
far as we know.
This is what's interesting about this whole sequence is you don't see the Jedi anywhere. You don't see the witches anywhere. It's just because you're just getting it from Osha's, like you're following
Yes.
Osha from this
You have
point
a very
on.
limited perspective of what occurred, and
Exactly.
OSHA was not
So
anywhere in the upper levels.
this is where
when-
there's the most questions in this episode to me anyway. So go ahead.
So yeah, my theory on
Right.
everything that happened on Brendok is Torben did the blood test. And in that blood test, they discovered that OSHA had a enormous amount of midichlorians because she is a being that was created through the Force. And similarly to Anakin, that stood out to the Jedi, and some Jedi interpreted it as that he could just she could just have a lot of midichlorians and it could just be a fluke, or possibly the prophecy of the chosen one already exists at this time.
Right.
And if that exists, then the Jedi could believe that Osha could be the chosen. And if that's the case, then that could have forced their hand in this situation because it seemed like they were playing it very defensively up until now. And we move forward into the episode where Osha is getting ready to leave. And as a reminder, we have this one line from Torben in the previous episode in which he says, "We thought we were doing the right thing," which is a very interesting thing to say, especially if they think that they are trying to get a hold of the chosen one, which is a very important thing for the Jedi to have a hold of. And so what I believe what happened is I think that the Jedi, because their hand was forced and they did the blood test, found out that she had all these midichlorians and that she wanted to be a Jedi, and they knew they needed her, came back to the Coven, and the Coven essentially said no, because it's heavily implied by the mother in the goodbye scene that they will say no to the Jedi about taking them.
Right.
And the Jedi, having their hand forced because it is the chosen one, strongly suggest that they should take the children away, and then the Night Sisters provoke an attack onto the Jedi because they're protecting their children. And we've already seen that these witches, Night Sisters or whatever, are willing to showcase their power in order to defend themselves.
Right.
And so they might have attacked first, or the Jedi might have attacked first. But in any case, someone attacks one or the other. Meanwhile, May is downstairs talking with Osha and trapping her inside of the room. And so May traps her inside, lights the fire, and then goes back up. When she goes back up, she does not get back up in time to see the actual battle, but something happens. Some kind of explosion happens, which, mind you, it sounds like an explosion of like fire or like gas or something, but in my opinion, it could also be some kind of like force explosion, like some kind of like pulling down the entire ceiling,
Right.
like a Jedi pulls down the entire ceiling on top of them and crushes them all. And that's the screaming that we hear. But ultimately, May gets up there, finds all of her coven dead, as well as her mother, and then retaliates against the Jedi in some kind of expression of the Force that then causes a greater fire up in the upper levels, which is what we see on the outside of the building. And then runs back down to Osha because now she realizes that Osha is the only one left because all of the others have died. And so now she's the only thing that is remaining of the coven that she held so dear. And so she runs back down and gets to that precipice point. Now, I've only watched the episode once, so I can't necessarily remember this exactly. But I believe in the moment when Soul is running down the tunnel, he calls May's name first,
He
which is
said, yeah, I rewatched it last night, and he says Osha and May. Like he says Osha, May, like one right after the other.
Okay,
So yeah.
okay. Interesting.
I did try. I did because you had mentioned
honestly,
that,
since they're twins, he might not know which is which.
right?
Um,
But you
and
did mention
so
that, and so I was like, well, I was paying a lot of attention. I was like, who did he say first, or did he say anything
okay.
separately? But yeah, no.
So I was under the assumption that he says May first, but even
Right.
if he says Osha or May, then that's fine. Ultimately, my theory is that Soul is chasing after May because May saw the carnage and everything that occurred during the battle between the Coven and the Jedi, and is trying to chase her down as she's running down to find Osha. Ultimately, he's not able to save both of them, but he does save the one that they want, which is Osha, the one that they were able to do a blood test for. And he pulls her out and then runs her through the building, and we see the dead Coven, but they're not on fire. Something else happened to them, so they were either cut down by lightsabers or some other kind of fate met them, like I mentioned with the pulling down of the ceiling or something. And then they race past her mother, and he pulls her away from her mother, possibly to hide any light we know of Brendok. Is that we know that something happened on Brendok in order to cause the Jedi to regret it later and to feel that the things they did on Brendok were so unforgivable that one of them went into the Bearish Vow for 10 years in penance for it.
Right.
And
Well,
so
and then
the
Kelnaka
Jedi had to
is
have done something.
well, and then Kelnaka's off on this other planet, like completely
Yeah,
by
he seems
himself.
exiled in
So
some
he
way.
seems like he's exiled himself,
Yeah.
possibly. So it's like definitely something is going on that has caused these Jedi to kind of like split and go off on their own and have these guilty consciences or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely odd. I think your theory is good. I don't necessarily fully go along with it. But because I don't know, my own theory was a little bit more like that the witches were doing a little something shady to pretend that they were dead. And but you know, I'm not certain, so I don't know. But it's an interesting um I like your theory, don't get me wrong. So but I we'll have to see what happens in these future episodes to see
Mm-hmm.
if it plays out like that. It'll be cool if it does though.
Yeah, I think like again, I don't like there's no way for me to know if my theory is accurate or not, but I think that I'm not too far off the mark in terms of what we've been presented, what
Yeah.
could be the thing that caused it all in the end. And it seems almost it seems very unlikely that the two pieces of evidence that we are given inside of this episode in that Torben tests their blood and that Osha and May are in some way created by the Force to not have some form of reaction by the Jedi to believe that they are possibly the chosen one. It
Right.
seems very unlikely because there is a lot of echoes of Anakin and his discovery by Qui-Gon inside of this episode, as well as just kind of almost presenting it in a way of was what if Anakin's mother was a lot less willing to give up her
Right.
child,
Yeah.
and exploring that idea on like what if the mother says no, or would the Jedi respect it, and also would the Jedi respect a no if it was the chosen one, someone that
Right.
they knew they had to train.
Right.
and
Well,
and
and
I think
that's
that's a very interesting question if that is what the episode is asking.
well, and to me, I feel like the answer to would they respect a no from anybody is no, they wouldn't, because they fully weren't respecting the no that they were giving them, that, you know, like, because that's what Indara was even saying, is that we have the right to test these children, and if they are, have force ability or whatever like that, then they will take them. You know what I mean? That's what it sounded like to me, is that they were full on ready to take these children regardless of what these people said. So and that's what kind of puts me on edge with these Jedi at this time as well, because as we talked about in the previous episode, they're a little too cavalier with their force abilities and with their place in the overall makeup of society, that they are like, the all-powerful people that they are. So
yeah,
and so
absolutely.
that's very, it's very, I don't know, it puts me on edge.
Yeah, I
So,
imagine the next episode we get is going to be more focused on what the story was in the first two episodes. And we're probably going to
yeah.
see more of Kelnaka, as well as more of Keimer and May. And we're probably not going to see Osha or Soul interact much with May or Keimer, but we will probably see a Jedi Council scene
Yeah,
with
because they
them.
needed to go back to the Jedi Council. Yeah.
And so that'll be interesting to see, as that will kind of go back into the present in terms of the political ramifications of the
Right.
scandal, and as well as the political, or like the present, the effects on the present that the events on Brendek that we saw through Osha's perspective inside of this episode will have.
Right.
And so I'm very excited in terms of that. I think that this was a very interesting episode to put in front of that scene, because I think that it is essentially the people behind the show telling us that this is necessary context for what you're going to see in the next episode.
Yes. Yeah. You needed to know this context for whatever's coming in this next episode, because whatever's in this next episode is going to reference that material.
Yeah.
So,
Because I'm sure that there will be references to that witch coven. I'm sure that there'll be something on Osha and her initial training. And yeah, I think I'm excited. I'm excited to see the next episode. I'm really interested to see what the next episode's going to have to deal with, because there's a lot that is going on right now, and I'm excited to see May and Keimer have to kind of figure out how to kill a Wookiee. And I think that
yeah,
might not be something that gets resolved in one episode. I think
not
that's
just a
probably going to be
Wookiee, but a
something.
Wookiee with the Force.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
Wookiee Jedi.
yeah.
And so I think that it's probably not going to be something that gets resolved in one episode. I'm sure they're probably going to have to track him down and possibly find an alternative method to kill him other than a like direct confrontation.
Right.
And so, so
We'll
that'll be
see.
interesting, because I mean, we all know that Wookiees tear people's arms off, and so I don't know if May's going to go in hand-to-hand combat with a Wookiee
Right.
and get out of that with both of her hands. And so we'll see.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I don't think I have anything else left to say about this episode. Um, it was a fun episode. I was very happy to see. I always like a good flashback episode that tells you, um, the past and gives us some cool stuff. So, um, but I'm excited for the next one as well. See where we go from here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know it might not be people's favorite show if you didn't get hooked on it early, but for me as a prequel kid and loving stuff about the Force, it's hitting all the right beats for me.
Right.
And I'm very interested to see where the story goes, because what I would love is a very downer ending where the Jedi are at a new low and are having to deal with the ramifications of their actions, because I think it's very intentional that the Jedi are acting very authoritatively inside of the show, and I think that there's going to be a reckoning to that,
Right.
and I'm very excited to see what that reckoning looks like.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I guess that just leaves us with we'll see you next episode, which should be out not too long after this next episode of the show. So
Mhm.
hopefully you'll be getting several episodes all within a short time frame of this show. And but hopefully you'll enjoy it, and hit us up on social media. We'll have all our links at the end of the episode and posted on the show notes as well. So,
Perfect.
Until next time, may the force be with you. As Father and Son is a Creepy and Geeky Presents production, produced and edited by Robert Clark and hosted by Robert and his son Harrison. If you like what you've heard, please consider giving the show 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and share the podcast on social media to help spread the word. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or at creepyandgeeky.com. You can follow the podcast by going to creepyandgeeky.com and clicking on any of the social links. If you'd like to follow me, you can find my links at geekthulu.com. You can follow Harrison on Twitter at SaberVista. All of the links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.